Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll start our reading of The Delectable Negro, Human Consumption and Homoeroticism Within U.S. Slave Culture, published posthumously by Vincent Woodward. The editors were Justin A. Joyce and Dwight A. McBride, with a foreword by E. Patrick Johnson. One of the things you have to remember about this text is that it was written after the author's death and that he was a part of a particular community. So he was writing with that perspective in mind. Editor's Note by Justin A. Joyce. I never had the chance to meet Vincent Woodward personally. Working through someone else's scholarship backward and forward for nearly 5 years, however, gives you a type of intimate knowledge of the working of his or her mind. From both his work and the reminiscences of his friends, I feel I've come to know something of him and feel I can confidently join his friends, family, and colleagues in their mourning. To have lost such a stunning intellect and cogent writer is truly a tragedy. The exhaustive research that went into this book, along with the cunning analytical mind that guides its prose, bears witness to a scholar driven by a search for new truths and a passion to share his insights. It is this drive and passion that pushed Vincent quite literally to the very end of his life. For despite, or perhaps because of, the illness that claimed his life, Vincent worked tirelessly, almost obsessively, to complete this book. A simultaneously ebullient and private man, Vincent kept his illness to himself until he could no longer hide it, working all the time at his scholarship. Through his sickness and treatments, he kept working. Through many disorienting medication, he kept working. Through the fog of severe sufferings, Vincent kept working. Up till his very last moments, his scholarship was on his mind, for his final wishes included a plea that his colleagues see this project to completion. The book the book you have before you then is a testament to the care with which these friends dedicated themselves to helping Vincent's hard work come to fruition. The manuscript for The Delectable Negro arrived on my desk, as it were, in 2008. My task was then a seemingly simple one: compile a bibliography for the notes and copy edit the text for submission. As I worked through the text, however, the state of Vincent's notes and missing references within the manuscript, no doubt due to his illness and the earnest pace that drove him to try to complete the manuscript when most people would be more worried over their terminal illness, presented additional challenges for publishing his work. These challenges included incomplete or missing citations, notes and citations that contained factual errors, and specific references within his notes that were either ambiguous or pointed to particular versions of popular texts that could not be fully identified. As I worked to compile the bibliography, it became increasingly evident that there were enough errors in the manuscript that we would be remiss to print it as it stood. To do so would be more than poor scholarship. It would be a dishonor to Vincent Woodward's legacy. What he's explaining away is why they changed the book so much from what they originally received. In order to be completely confident in the accuracy of his notes and references, the only proper course was to check each and every reference for accuracy. As anyone would imagine, this entailed considerable effort and research time. To work backward through the scholar's research trajectory, tracking down each citation, reference, and mention through archival materials is a colossal undertaking. This Herculean task was not completed alone. It is only fitting to acknowledge here the hard work of two student assistants, Matthew Allen Lang at the University of Illinois at Chicago and Andrew Brown at Northwestern University. Without their diligent attention and assistance, Vincent's work might have never seen the light of day. It is fitting here to acknowledge also the incredible tolerance of NYU Press and Vincent's family. Without their enduring patience, the Delectable Negro would have been a much poorer tribute to Vincent's hard work. It is truly unfortunate that Vincent Woodward could not see his own work to press. It is also unfortunate that his manuscript lacked a proper conclusion. In the introduction to the extant manuscript that was passed on to Dwight A. McBride and E. Patrick Johnson, Vincent makes reference to a coda wherein he planned to extend his discussion beyond the confines of slavery and a strictly black white dynamic of hunger and homoeroticism. For the coda of the book, Cannibal Nation, I returned more broadly and meditatively to the 19th century concern that the U.S. had become a cannibal nation. I look at instances of U.S. frontiersmen and soldiers consuming or harvesting the flesh of Native Americans. While my focus has been African American experience, I branch out in the conclusion to suggest how the consumption of Black persons coincided with the literal and cultural consumption of other groups seen as expendable or marginal to the U.S. nation making endeavor. Going deeper into the Black experience, I tease out within African American Reconstruction culture how Black people maintained an implicit critique of institutionalized U.S. cannibalism. At the same time, they denigrated Africa and saw Africans and African cultural practices as heathen and cannibal. Given that Africans and African Americans had strong, vibrant indigenous traditions that accounted for and even posed remedy for human consumption, I speculate about why such traditions were not more widely acknowledged nor integrated into the public sphere. Excuse me. Through the material that Vincent planned for the book's coda, though the material that Vincent planned for the book's coda is lost, his groundbreaking combination of challenging ideas yet goes forth. Countless corrections to references and citations have been made in order to present his work in the best possible light. Any errors or omissions that remain are entirely mine. The innovative ideas and approachable prose style in this manuscript, however, are all Vincent. What he's doing is making an apology for changing so widely the author's original intent. So recognize that as we read through this, he's telling this story through a white liberal's lens. Greetings, Forecast and Anthony McPhail. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. I appreciate you. The foreword was by E. Patrick Johnson. The Delectable Negro is a provocative reading of race relations vis a vis an almost indiscernible homoeroticism in the 19th century. According to Woodward, such homoeroticism was always already there but our contemporary framing of homosexuality has obscured our vision. Moreover, he suggests that the absence of an appropriate linguistic apparatus, the dearth of historical documentation, and the lack of theoretical models with which, as he documents actual instances in slave and ex slave narratives, autobiographies, and WPA interviews of whites' literal consumption of black flesh. Thus, instead of the question Du Bois frames as the most compelling problem facing the Negro in the 20th century, Woodward argues that another question was already on the forefront of the Negro's mind in the 19th century. How does it feel to be an edible, consumed object? The erotic charge catalyzed in the process of consumption, according to Woodward, was not unidirectional, but also emanated from Black men toward white men and toward each other. Indeed, Woodward dares to speak of Black men's sexual agency around their own libidinal desires and how those desires and acts were mobilized in the service of their own self preservation from literal and spiritual consumption. In The Delectable Negro, Woodward convincingly analyzes the psychosexual details of consumption as it flowed both ways. The result is a fierce rethinking of the ways in which capitalism, racism, and sexuality functioned within a slave economy that framed the libidinal formation of race relations for generations. Vincent Woodward's thinking on this topic evolved over a 10-year period, beginning in graduate school. I met him and heard him talk about this research for the first time in 1999 at the University of Texas at Austin, where I had been invited to perform and where he was a graduate student in English and American Studies. Like many self actualized Black gay academics, he understood the precariousness of the profession he had chosen and proceeded accordingly. Now, note, what he's saying is that he is also Black, gay, and in the academic field, as was Woodward. So, this is the community perspective that they come from, and then they hire a white liberal to synthesize this information. Continuing. That is to say, he understood the old adage, you have to be twice as good, a mantra most Black folks were taught growing up, as well as a fact that his gayness would be both a hindrance and an asset within the academy depending on the context and how that identity marker would be consumed by his students, colleagues, and critical interlocutors. Working his way through graduate school at the height of queer theory and during the nascent stages of Black queer studies meant Woodward had to negotiate mastering the established field of queer studies while also following in the footsteps of his peers and mentors who were waging a critique against queer theory's blind spots to race. In some ways, it was the best time to be in graduate school, to take advantage of the explosion of new work and to be a part of the theoretical and political conversations generated by scholars and activists committed to legitimizing sexuality studies in the academy. But in other ways, the late 1990s and the early 2000s were a challenging time for graduate students who sometimes were overwhelmed by the sheer volume and multiple twists and turns of this emerging scholarship, and who sometimes felt trapped, both professionally and politically, in a world where just the mere topic of their dissertation or who their advisor was could determine whether or not they were taken seriously as scholars or if they would be on a or if they would be viable on the job market. Vincent and I discussed all of this and more over emails and visits during the early years of our friendship. And although he thought of me as a mentor as much as he did a friend, it was always I who was impressed with the way his mind worked. I'll never forget, for example, the first time he discussed with me his ideas about writing about cannibalism and homoeroticism. At the time, there was nothing I could offer by way of feedback or encouragement, mainly because I thought it would be too intellectually ambitious to imbricate these two topics in the context of slavery. I became a believer, however, when Vincent sent me the first draft of this manuscript in 2005, which was then titled Recovering the Black Male Womb: Slavery, Homoeroticism, and 19th Century Racial Uplift. I wrote notes and questions on just about every page because the ideas were so provocative. I was still unsure, however, if he would be able to successfully pull together everything that he wanted to say and justify all of the claims that he was making. The turning point came in 2006 at the American Studies Association conference in Oakland, California, where Vincent delivered a paper entitled Blood, Magic, and Sorcery in the State Formation Archive, in which he laid out what would become the key terms of Delectable Negro as unearthed in the archive: consumption, hunger, homoeroticism, and slavery. It seemed the entire conference was abuzz with talk about Woodward's paper, and it would be the turning point for Woodward as he began to hone in on two topics that were too taboo for even the most courageous of academics: cannibalism and same sex desire under slavery. For those who knew Vincent Woodward and understood his genius, the theorizing and analysis contained in the pages of this book will come as no surprise. And for those who experience it for the first time, they will be in for a treat. Vincent knew how to tell a good story, and this one of his finest is one of his finest, and he knew it. That is why, In the final days of his life, he told his colleague, John Michael Riviera, at the University of Colorado Boulder, to make sure that this manuscript got to Dwight A. McBride and to me so that we could get it published. And that is what Dwight and I have worked toward for the past 5 years with the assistance of Justin A. Joyce and a host of undergraduate and graduate research assistants. And quietly but persistently urging us on have been his parents, Vera and Cedric Woodward, who have waited patiently to see the fruits of their son's labor. I am still in denial about Vincent's passing because I feel his presence so viscerally. He was an immediately recognizable he was immediately recognizable as a gender queer. That day in 1999 in Austin when we first met at a coffee shop, he strolled in wearing a sarong and flowing locks and exhibiting a bohemian confidence. We spent hours talking about poetry, politics, and Black people. Many often mistook his soft spoken demeanor as a sign of timidity, but soon discovered, as I did, that this could not be further from the truth. On many occasions, I witnessed the lioness in Vincent emerge. Whether dealing with a waiter at a restaurant whose service was insulting, or flinging a zinger at a scholar who was being obtuse or apolitical in their presentation, Vincent was deft and deliberate in the delivering of his thoughts about someone being trifling. What was so funny about these instances is that as soon as he had his say, the sweet, gentle, nonchalant Vincent would turn back to you and pick up where he left off in the conversation before the object of his wrath had so rudely interrupted him. Plainly, Vincent was a fierce diva, but only when it was necessary. He was centered both in who he was as a person and as an activist. This is probably because Vincent was such a spiritual person and praised the ancestors in every aspect of his life. Now that he has crossed over, his own spirit is traveling the universe, radiating the poetic goodness of his soul. Now he has left the delectable Negro as his legacy for us to consume. As we partake of it, may we think of Vincent sashaying through our digestive tract, providing us with the nutrients for the soul, but also giving us a little heartburn along the way. Nothing this good ever goes down easy, and Vincent wouldn't have it any other way. So, as you can see, many of his friends and many of the people that knew him had interesting ideas about his life and his lifestyle, but he was a part of a certain community, and that community carries a certain perspective. And we have to be able to read and review this with that in mind. Greetings, Cicely Milano. Thanks so much for tuning in. She says this is a good book, but the end of the book gets kind of weird, but that makes sense with a white gay liberal. Exactly. And that's what I want you to understand and appreciate, that there's a certain perspective that we have to understand this book was edited with, and that it was heavily edited by that white gay liberal. Introduction. Master eated me when I was meat. In the summer of 2007, I visited Somerset Place in Cresswell, North Carolina. At one point, Somerset Place, a historically restored plantation, was the most successful plantation in North Carolina, and its owner, Josiah Collins III, was one of the largest slaveholders in the state. It is now a state historic site sitting on over 100 acres of lush forest and wetland. My party and I arrived early one Saturday morning, parked near the overseer's quarters, and walked the red cobblestone road down the center of the plantation, past the stocks, past the smokehouse, past the outside cooking facilities, to the gift shop where the tour begins. My travel companions browsed the bookstore while I sat in the adjoined seating area, taking in the genealogy of enslaved persons who had formerly lived on the plantation. Someone had conveniently mounted photographs and biographies of these persons on the walls. There was Darius Bennett, a Somerset field hand who had heard the cannons signaling the Civil War. There was Betsy Spurrell Riddick, seated with hands folded before a wooden shack. There was even a makeshift family tree dating back to the first enslaved Africans to arrive on Somerset Plantation. After a while, all of us there for the morning tour made our way into the seating area where our tour guide finally came in and stood before us. He wore khaki pants, a maroon polo shirt, and glasses. He was blonde haired, blue eyed, and stood about 6 foot 3 inches tall. For the sake of discussion, I'll refer to him as Mr. Swellfellow because he had that look of a good hometown guy. He probably lived in the same neighborhood as his mother, if not with his mother, volunteered at the local fire department, had a high school sweetheart he was engaged to. He went to church every Sunday, and as far as I could see, wore honesty about his face like a child wears a milky mustache. He was totally disarming and chubby and southern and immediately attentive. Standing before us, leaning on the mantel of the fireplace. After warming to us, he began by talking about the pictures on the wall and quickly segued into minor details about the plantation. Not all of the original buildings had been restored to the plantation. This was a walking tour that would begin at the overseer's quarters and end at the big house. A woman who had once tried to escape was put into the stocks in the wintertime. Her legs froze and they had to be amputated. Each month, enslaved adults received a ration of a peck of corn and 3 pounds of dried meat. The slaves on this plantation were well fed, Mr. Swellfellow emphasized, before rattling off more details about the tour. I tried to stay focused, but my mind returned to the rationed meat and cornmeal. The fact that field labor would have depleted such rations in a week, and the image of happy, well fed darkies ever so casually introduced into Mr. Swellfellow's presentation. I raised my hand and waited for Mr. Swellfellow to call on me. And true to his namesake, Mr. Swellfellow noticed my hand and welcomed my question. Mr. Swellfellow, I began, I want to go back to an earlier point you made for clarification. You said that the enslaved were given a peck of corn and 3 pounds of meat. And then you said they were well fed. But to my thinking, the enslaved must have gone hungry, especially those working in the fields who would have needed more substance than this to sustain them in a backbreaking, day long labor. The smile on Mr. Swellfellow's face dimmed a little, even as he formulated an entirely hopeful response. The slaves were well fed, he insisted. It was not in the economic interest of the master to starve them. And besides, the Collinses were kind and had benevolent relations with their slaves. They weren't the type to make their slaves go hungry. Actually, Mr. Swellfellow, I interrupted, it was in the economic interest of the slave masters to starve their slaves. This fact is well documented in literature written by fugitive slaves, and on the subject of kindness, the so called kindness of masters hardly ever, to my knowledge, interfered with their profit motive. What better way to profit than by giving your slaves minimal nourishment while you expect, in return for your investment, maximum labor output? Only after I stopped speaking did I realize that I was shaking internally and had taken an edge to my voice. I became aware of my African American travel companions sitting across the room and a few other white tourists who were part of our morning party. Mr. Swellfellow had flushed and began to sweat. He had become anxious and nervous. Clearly, his National Parks Service tour guide training had not prepared him to deal with, in a knowledgeable manner, with questions of hunger and starvation on the plantation. Perhaps, too, he felt embarrassed at his immediately defensive posture, embarrassed at his rushing to defend the master, and finally embarrassed and angry at my daring to challenge what was clearly a sacred memory: contented, well fed blacks roaming about the plantation. Needless to say, this initial interaction with Mr. Swellfellow set the tone for the remainder of the tour. When during the walking tour, we brought up the subject of enslaved persons stealing meat from the smokehouse, I responded by asking why such well-fed persons would have provocation to steal meat in the first place. At one point, thoroughly frustrated with the constant reinforcement of the pastoral and goodly nature of life on Somerset Plantation, I said to our tour guide, so that everyone could hear, Mr. Swellfellow, it seems to me that you in the state of North Carolina are invested in an image of the masters as goodly, and that you are not willing to entertain perspectives of plantation life that go against this reality. Swellfellow, sweating even more profusely, denied my accusations and did his best to avoid me for the remainder of the tour. The history of slavery continues to have meaning in the 20th century. It burdens all of American history and is incorporated into public interpretations of the past. Write James Oliver Horton and Lewis E. Horton. We need only look as far as Somerset Place for an example of historically laden and contested site of slave memory. There, we see the circumstances of slave existence and the meaning of the master's authority and goodwill as fluid, contested categories of experience regulated by the state of a larger master narrative of slave history. Similar issues regarding the meaning and import of slavery have affected contemporary battlefields and Civil War sites operated by the National Park Service. As a result of pressure from Civil War heritage interest groups, those who give tours at these sites do not speak of slavery as the major social phenomenon that catalyzed the Civil War. In higher education, another state regulated realm, the history of slavery continues to shape our lives. A good example of this is Brown University. Brown, like a number of other universities on the East Coast, has ties to slavery that trace back to its founder, John Brown. Members of Brown's educational community have attempted to reconcile the university's historic and economic ties with the institution of slavery, have in the process encountered staunch resistance from the regents and alumni, among other constituencies. From contemporary debates over national identity to concerns about modern civil rights, the legacy of slavery continues to inform and impact our sense of civic belonging and investment in this experiment called the United States. Living as we do, in a society in which many still deny the fundamental tie between the Civil War and slavery, helps me to better understand on a systemic level Mr. Swellfellow's resistance to my insinuations of institutionalized hunger on the Somerset plantation. An admission of institutionalized hunger on the plantation would have required Mr. Swellfellow to alter his notions of the goodly, altruistic master, as well as such an allowance would have required that Mr. Swellfellow consider how sentimental conventions, Christian morals and values, Southern state formation, and statecraft all informed our discussion of slaves made to hunger on the plantation. While Mr. Swellfellow had his own geographically bounded, he was from the surrounding area, and personal reasons for denying the existence of slave hunger, my insistence upon the topic arose mostly from the researching for and writing of this book. I had come to know through my research that instances of hunger within such a pristine, well kept context were often only indicators of a much larger culture of institutionalized hunger. I had encountered numerous masters like Somerset's Josiah Collins, who one biographer described as an autocrat with a will as imperious and a sway as absolute as the Czar himself. Josiah the Third, I would find out months after my plantation tour, fit the profile of the cultivated, overlording type of master who used hunger and all manner of social conditioning to wring from enslaved people maximum labor and to instill in these persons fear and self denial. Hunger, with such persons as Collins, was often only the tip of the iceberg. So much more than hunger was at stake in my interactions with Mr. Swellfellow. If he and I could not talk about hunger on the plantation, then we would never, as individuals or a nation, be able to talk about other intersecting issues such as social consumption, ritualized hunger, or cannibalistic masters populating southern plantations such as Somerset Place. For my part, my encounters at Somerset Place disturbed me and catalyzed me in a state of personal and intellectual reflection. Was the nation, not to mention the state of North Carolina, ready for an open and inquiring discussion into the topics of hunger and human consumption on the plantation? Was I ready to and capable of serving as a mediator of that discussion, which clearly had a life beyond the book pages I had labored to fill over the years? In the 19th century, none but the most radical abolitionists believed the enslaved person's claims about consuming masters and their descriptions of a culture of human consumption pervading plantation life. Over a century later, not much has changed. Not only had we collectively forgotten many of the significant details of slavery that continue to impact the present, but we also had willed ourselves to forget the horrific forms that human hunger and the pursuit of power could take. Despite our will to forget and desire to reconfigure the past, the reality is that institutionalized hunger and practices of human consumption characterized by life on many southern plantations. No topic disturbed and mystified 19th century America like the subject of human consumption under slavery. For the most part, whites during the time responded to this topic, as did Mr. Swellfellow, with an air of secrecy and shame. For example, one of the most notorious incidents of literal Black consumption from the 19th century involved members of the whaling ship Essex, which sailed from Nantucket, Massachusetts in 1838. White Nantucketers still today have little to say about the incident, especially the fact that the first four crew members to be murdered and eaten by whites were Black. Nantucket was known in the 19th century as a Quaker and abolitionist stronghold, with its residents then and still today find it hard to explain ship captains operating as slave drivers. African persons treated in a brutish manner aboard whaling ships, and more poignantly, the master slave ideology informing the consumption of the four Black men. Colonial era Nantucketers were not alone in their self preserving silence. Slave owning whites, for different reasons, covered up the reality of Black consumption. Take, for example, the circumstances surrounding the consumption of Nat Turner, the Black insurrectionist. Black members of Southampton, Virginia community left oral records of whites who tried to coerce them into consuming Nat Turner's boiled down flesh and entrails. Black persons also implied that 19th century whites might have consumed the revolutionary as a medicinal substance. Whites from the time period dismissed such ideas as folk belief arising from the backward and infantile culture of older darkies. To add to this, Scholars of Turner's experience have, on the whole, denied, infantilized, infantilized, or dismissed the observations of Black persons. These scholars, it seems, were not aware of those aspects of U.S. plantation culture that were based in parasitism and a dynamic of human consumption. In Slavery and Social Death, a comparative study, Orlando Patterson describes slavery as a parasitic institution that white masters strove to conceal in ideology and act. According to Patterson, the slaveholder, in order to maintain an image of himself as civilized and free of parasitic appetites, camouflaged his dependence, his parasitism, by various ideological strategies. Paradoxically, he defined the slave as dependent. This is consistent with the human technique of camouflaging a relation by defining it as the opposite of what it really is. Parasite is the perfect concept for my purposes, as it implies a wide range of consumptive acts, some resulting in immediate death, but most involving the passage of time and the incremental feeding upon the human host. Most of my examples of consumption on and off the plantation range from the literal murder and eating of Black persons to what we might think of as metaphoric acts. I refer to these metaphoric acts, which encompass starving, flesh seasoning rituals, and sexual modes of consumption, variously as consumption, human consumption, metaphoric consumption, instances of social consumption, and yes, even cannibalism. I will explain the historical and contemporary significance of such terms as cannibal later in the introduction. But I wanted to acknowledge here that I do use a range of terms to describe instances of consumption. My cluster of terms challenges the layers of stereotype and imprecise language that have historically characterized the topic of consumption of slaves. As a common strategy, masters often hid their appetites and hungers in stereotypes and ideologies that attributed these characteristics to the slaves. Patterson describes a reality wherein the master deflected his appetites and hungers onto myths of the chattel slave as dependent, childlike, and somehow ennobled by the master's consumptive needs. In dismissing the bonded person's accusations of consumption as infantile rants, which I point out using Turner's example, scholars have reinforced this slave owning, ruling class mentality and have helped to maintain a general code of silence regarding the master's appetites and sycophantic needs. This pattern of silencing has resulted in the dismissal of the reality of those enslaved persons who frequently describe slaves as an outgrowth of the master's homoerotic and consumptive appetites. Within U.S. slavery, Black men and women consistently described incidents of human consumption that occurred in a literal, metaphoric, and institutional levels of social interaction. These incidents often had a homoerotic or sexual charge to them. John S. Jacobs, for example, referred to his former masters as human fleshmongers, possessed of an unnatural hunger for human flesh and soul. Naked bodies depicted on the auction block, instances of rape and sexualized torture coincide with the hunger and satiation described by Jacobs. For Solomon Northrop, the gastronomical enjoyments and excesses of whites included the sexualized treatment of men, such as himself, at the hands of slave catchers, overseers, and masters. Harriet Jacobs recorded in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, how white mistresses acted out hungers for and erotic desires for black women in intimate spaces on the plantation. Issues of sexual dominance and white male fixations on black male virility informed the consumption of Nat Turner. Acknowledging how scholars of U.S. and transatlantic slavery have largely ignored and dismissed accusations of the cannibalizing of Black Americans, I take the enslaved person's claims of human consumption seriously, and I attempt throughout this project to draw attention to how Blacks experienced their consumption as fundamentally erotic and, more specifically, homoerotic occurrence. Given the taboo nature of homoeroticism in the 19th century, Black people rarely wrote about same sex experiences or encounters with whites. In the context of consumption, though, this topic was unavoidable. For Blacks could not identify, name in language and concept, negotiate, nor resist the culture of human consumption they saw pervading plantation life without unearthing the erotic implications of their consumption and, even more, constructing a sexual politics that included homoeroticism. Amazingly, 19th century Black Americans, without any conscious forethought, created an entirely new language and symbolic system to describe not just their consumption, but also the deeper homoerotic nuances of Black life under slavery. Linking this personal reality to the larger national political terrain, they developed strategies of resistance, a politics of moral accountability, and a social vision of human consumption that implicated the most cherished values and tenets of the Republic. When Black Americans described instances of eating, cooking, and consumption of flesh in slave narratives, newspaper articles, speeches, testimonials, sermons, and autobiographies, they not only questioned the national body politic, but also tried to understand why and how they had become so delectable, so erotically appetizing to a nation and a white populace that, at least rhetorically, denied and despised their humanity. A New Orleans physician named Samuel A. Cartwright perfectly captured this denial of and despising of the Negro in his medical writings. Cartwright's popular views depicted the Negro as childlike, lacking civilization, and therefore completely an undesirable species. On the topic of Negro infantile behavior, he writes, Negroes, moreover, resemble children in the activity of the liver and in their strong assimilating powers, and in the predominance of other systems over the sanguineous. Comparing the Negro's skin to that of an animal hide, he describes how his skin is very thick and how he has a membrane called the plica lunaris, like that which is observed in apes. He reserves his most sweeping comments for so called African biological and racial inferiority, which, in his opinion, has rendered the people of Africa unable to take care of themselves. In reality, of course, enslaved Black persons took care of whites, who often acted as sycophantic children in their demands, hungers, and insatiable needs. Under this cloud of delusion, wherein whites depicted the Negro as the helpless adult infant that they themselves embodied, white hungers for and desires for the Negro to flourish. On the level of acquired taste for the Negro, Cartwright's pseudo medical science portrays how myths of the Negro child, of the eroticized and animal like African, stoked white appetites and made the Negro into a delectable, desirous object. So their descriptions of us and their attempts to dehumanize us only fueled the fire for their appetite to consume us. Because as he described us as animals, they were like, I'd eat that. And they did. Such references to Black people as animal like, infantile, and disfigured proliferate the pro slavery rhetoric. They are so common that we do not naturally think of them as indexes of desire, of white people's fixation upon and obsessions with Black bodies and Black sex. Even more, we are not in the habit of reading homoeroticism into comments made by persons such as Cartwright. Within the culture of consumption, there existed numerous examples of homoerotic affection between Black and white men, sexualized violence, and incest bonds, among other phenomena. Yet such affections were often veiled or hidden within rhetorics or objectification and objection. For white men, sex with and sexual attraction to Black men was a natural byproduct of their physical, emotional, and spiritual hunger for the same. For Black men, on the other hand, homoeroticism was a means of resisting, accommodating, and transforming the discourse of Black consumption. For example, in the process of speaking about their sexual consumption, Black men crossed gender boundaries, adopted the genders and identities of Black and white women, and imagined themselves as giving birth to new archetypes of the nation. Within Black nationalist movements, dating from slavery to the 1960s, Black men linked effeminacy and homosexuality with the white desire to culturally and spiritually consume Black men. Even Black women, in the late 20th century linked their discussions of mother hunger and self consumption during slavery with violent acts of homoeroticism. References to male rape and oral violation, while the culture of U.S. consumption frames my narrative. This book is as much about homoeroticism as it is about flesh consumption through multiple desires. African American men and women successfully resisted their consumption and constructed racial politics based in the hunger and desire to recover and self, to recover self and collective. So as you can see, these white people saw us as food because they desired us, they lusted after us, they wanted us, they wanted to consume every aspect of us. Do you think that went away in the modern era? No, it hasn't. Transatlantic origins of Black consumption. The origins of this U.S. culture of consumption trace back to the first contact between European colonizers and coastal Africans. By the early 20th century, even Europeans admitted to and documented a connection between European global expansion and a sexual libidinal appetite for African flesh. A cartoon published in the French journal Le Rire in 1911 demonstrates how European hungers for conquest sometimes coincided with homosexual hunger for African flesh. In the foreground of the cartoon, a porter, a soldier, and a general gather around a Bakongo man stabbed into a skewer. The Bakongo man spins around and awaits in the slice of the butcher knife resting at his knees. A 1937 cartoon published in the Belgian magazine Hoogerleven that also depicted Europeans' cannibalism had a caption that perfectly captured the irony of an African turning on a skewer. Any takers for Negro soup? Such cartoons depict a different species of cannibal and an altogether different master narrative of cannibalism informing European expansion into Africa. The word Congo is tattooed on the African man's loincloth, establishing a connection between the carving up of Africa by numerous European nations and the carving up of the African male body. The homoerotic bonds shared among the white men gathered around the African man highlight the promise of Negro soup, with the Bakongo or Congo man serving as a symbol of their common purpose and desire. The African body is spread eagled before his tableau of male bonding. The general and his captain of arms, who turns the skewer, look across the black man's body into one another's eyes. The other men, bent over the half naked body, appear to be captivated by their vulnerable prey, turning delectably on the skewer. One soldier had his hand on his hips. The other has his palms pressed together and tucked tightly into his groin. The knife in the general's hand resembles a phallus, thick on the bottom and narrower at the tip. With this phallus in one hand, The general squats between the African man's legs, holding his calves apart. The Bakongo man is positioned in a manner that provides for easy access, the missionary position. In the Belgarian cartoon, sexual erotic tastes are indistinguishable from the palate. The knife and the phallus are interchangeable signifiers. This cartoon depicts a widespread belief in Western and Central Africa that Europeans were cannibals. Groups such as the Igbo, Bakongo, Bantu, and Guinea all thought of European interlopers as cannibals. A century earlier, for example, Isami, Ali Isami of the Borneo people in Nigeria described his encounter with a European cannibal in a manner laden with terror and homoeroticism. Isami is transported as a slave throughout many Western African regions. Slave traders finally bring him and a group of kinsmen to the home of a white minister in Bathurst in 1818. The minister comes out of his home and surveys all the slaves. He takes a marked interest in Isami, who recalls that the man took hold of my hand and drew me into his house. According to Isami and the other Africans assembled, the white man strongly desires him, takes a delectable interest in this Bornu man. The terrors and observations of the other enslaved African persons erupt into whispered rumor. The white man has taken Ali and put him into the house in order to slaughter him. Inside the house, imagines his seducer wielding a phallic object, a long knife. If this white man takes a knife, he thinks to himself, and I see it in his hand, I will hold it. The threat of sexual domination and dismemberment hovers around the edges of Isami's imagination. The Africans translate white male phallic power over the effeminized African subject into an erotics of appetite and eating. And as you can see, these are the comics that they were talking about earlier, where the white man is standing there with a phallic object with the black man's spread eagle and Congo wrapped around his genitalia, and the white man with a spear coming up to cut it off and cut it open. Now, they also have a flipped version of a white man with a spread eagle with surrounded by black people with a phallic shaped knife there, but this is their opinion and this is how they see us. And this is the other one where they are literally scooping Negroes out into bowls to consume the continent, to consume us literally, as they wait there hungrily, dividing up the people that are available. So, this is how they see us. This is how they literally consume us. The slave trade ferried this culture of homoeroticism and consumption aboard slave ships across the Atlantic, where it took root and assumed a number of new forms in the context of chattel slavery. For example, within plantation culture, this culture of consumption took the form of whites literally filleting and smoking African American flesh and overt references in slave narratives to masters literally and metaphorically consuming their slaves. For the slave, this culture of consumption was a fact of daily life, as was amply documented in slave narratives, ri- Works Progress Administration interviews or WPA interviews of ex slaves, letters, political treaties, and autobiographies from the antebellum period. The Belgian cartoon Ali Isami and the literal and metaphorical consumption documented in slave narratives, letters, WPA interviews, autobiographies, and the like are each examples of a horrific dimension of African American experience that is difficult, if not impossible, to put into language. Toni Morrison referred to this region of African American experience as the unspeakable. In her writing about 19th century literature and slave culture, she makes subtle references to a white culture of consumption. In an example from Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, Morrison describes whites, and in particular, a white slave mistress, as gathering identity unto herself from the wholly available and serviceable lives of Africanist others. Morrison describes a social and emotional form of cannibalism or parasitism taking place in the context of plantation culture. This subject of cannibalism so disturbed the white, educated female audience of Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative that she moved all references to flesh cooking, flesh carving, and eating in her slave narrative to one chapter that readers could conveniently skip. Many morally conscious whites registered the disturbing implications of cannibalism and sought to address its national implications, for example, in Herman Melville's Moby Dick or The Whale, written in 1851, which the author based upon incidents of consumption of black males at sea. Ishmael draws a parallel between Cannibal Shipmate and George Washington, between his cannibal shipmate and George Washington, the first president of the United States. Q. Quegg says Ishmael about his companion. Was George Washington cannibalistically developed? Is it possible that our beloved slave owning first president and founding father George Washington embodied cannibalistic hungers? This question, posed through a fictional character, struck at the heart of American founding mythologies. National issues of hunger and taste, genteel posturing, and the ideas of pure white paternity. For African Americans, this question was much more personal and poignant. Most slave narratives contained overt or covert references to flesh eating. In his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written in 1845, Frederick Douglass described the entire institution of slavery as a towering cannibal being. There stood slavery, gnawing, glaring frightfully upon us, its robes already crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now, feasting itself greedily upon our own flesh. Most of what Douglas knew and felt, though, about this institutionalized cannibalism remains unspeakable and undocumented. I wish, he says, I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. In part, the subject of cannibalism has been unspeakable for Black men because of the homoerotic implications of such experiences. Cara Walker, commenting upon European and white cannibalism, has observed that there is little there is a little bit of masochism, so much love and hate involved in eating something, to kill something and to eat it. It's very sexual, very sensual. The consumption of black flesh often took place in the context of incestuous plantation dynamics. A master would often choose a favorite male slave as the object of his cultivated delight. Black men in such contexts have had to negotiate feelings of affection, hatred, shame, sexual degradation, arousal toward white men. So, what he's saying is that as a black enslaved person, right, you had all of these complicated feelings, which included sexual arousal toward white men, right? While at the same time being degraded. So that's modern day slave play, shame, hatred toward them and of yourself, and feelings of affection because they were the ones taking care of you. So you have all of these complex feelings going on from this author's and this editor's perspective as an enslaved man. Cannibalism was unspeakable, but cannibalism, coupled with the subject of homoeroticism, went against conventional ideas of Black men as stoic, as embodiments of the valiant struggle of will and mind over body, as agents of reason, and political strategy. To speak about the feelings associated with his own flesh consumption would have aligned Douglas too deeply with the unspeakable knowledge of the body as a sexual and sensual object, potentially undermining the literary and literate authority we have come to associate with his masculinity. So, what he's saying is that if Frederick Douglass had confronted these feelings of sexual attraction and affection and hatred and shame and lust and desire, then the legacy of Frederick Douglass would have been impacted because we would see him differently and not as the masculine man that we see him as today. Now, he has a complicated history because in the end, he wound up with a white woman, right? So he has a complicated history as it is, but at least his masculinity is not being called to the forefront. Right. Long before the poignant questions of the color line and the Negro problem registered in the Black imagination, it seems that a more pressing problematic confronted the Black citizen. In the form of a question, it might have registered as, how does it feel to be an edible, consumed object? In other words, how does it feel to be an energy source and foodstuff? To be consumed on the levels of body, sex, psyche, and soul. Answers to such questions had personal and national implications. As the personal plight of the Negro formed part of a larger homoerotic master narrative, of colonial conquest and male desire. For the Negro, as well as the white person, such questions necessitated a reconsideration of basic American values, such as gentility and social etiquette, colonial drive and hunger, and cherished racial categorizations, linking homoeroticism to cannibalism. My study emphasizes homoeroticism over homosexuality, which is interesting because he was a genderqueer male writing for that community. By definition, homoeroticism implies same sex arousal and draws attention to those political, social, and libidinal forces that shape desire and ultimately the homosexual act. The homosexual components of the feasting, partaking of the boiling pot of Negro soup, are less important to me than the racial assumptions, political aspirations, gender codes, philosophical frameworks, and cosmologies that dictated the feelings of arousal on the part of European and white Americans toward Black males and hunger for Black male flesh. For example, the larger discussion of Negro effeminacy or the idea of the Negro as the lady of the races shapes European male desire in the Belgian cartoon. It sets the stage for homosexual consumption and makes possible what Eve Sedgwick refers to as homosocial bonding. Sedgwick has written about the Victorian era homosocial desire as operating through triangulation, operating through its relation to women and the gender system as a whole. Her referent for gender is the female body. However, in the cartoons discussed above, the African man functions as the feminized figure. Through him, the general, the soldiers, the porters, and the field attendants bond and share in homoerotic desire. The final outcome of the Negro soup scene is a type of homosexual consumption. However, long before we get to the homosexual act, the machinery of homoeroticism clicks into play, shaping and dictating the meaning of significance of the homosexual act. David Halperin has cautioned against easy conflations of modern conceptions of sexual subjectivity with those that figured in the emotional lives of pre modern subjects. So basically, just because it looks like this to us today doesn't mean that's what it was at the time that this particular thing was being conceived. So don't look at the past with today's standards and morals, right? His concerns reflect the general understanding within queer theory of homosexuality as a constructed historical phenomenon. Medical and psychological discourses at the turn of the 20th century normalized and pathologized the homosexual personality type. The word homosexual was, in turn, reclaimed by same sex identified activists, intellectuals, and cultural workers in the 50s and 60s. However, the word homosexual had no currency in the 18th and 19th century. Neither, for that matter, did the word homoeroticism. Taking to heart the importance and necessity of historical specificity, I do not attempt to homoeroticize Black experience in the 19th century. That is, I do not attempt to graft an arbitrary language and sexual modality onto the time period. The word homoeroticism, in my study, serves as a referent for a large set of same sex desires and intimacies that include romantic friendship between men, same sex incest in the context of plantation patriarchy, the romanticization and exoticization of whiteness, and the literal and metaphorical cannibalism, among other things. All of these things I identify and extrapolate from their appropriate historical and cultural contexts. Often, though, when a blanket term is called for, I use the word homoeroticism to refer to any combination of these subcategories of experience. By coupling homoeroticism with cannibalism, I have sought to ground the meaning of the word cannibalism in the African European encounter and in the Middle Passage, the original site of Black sexual erotic encounter. Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness resuscitates the Atlantic as a living symbolic and cultural entity for Black people of the African diaspora. Gilroy effectively recast the Atlantic as a 20th century migratory structure through the image of ships composed of triangular routes along which Black people in South Africa, England, and the Americas have ferried philosophical, political, and musical materials. Like Gilroy, I also appeal to the African diaspora as a site of Black cultural formation and transmission. However, for me, the organizing metaphor is not the ship, but the captured bodies brought aboard slave ships and the ways these bodies, specifically male bodies, underwent a process of sexual and social cannibalization. Traditionally, historical considerations of cannibalism in the context of European exploration and occupation of foreign lands focus on European ideas of natives, American and African, as cannibals. Take the 1503 decree of Queen Isabella of Spain that dictated that no Indians under her dominion were to be hurt or captured. However, a certain people called cannibals might be fairly fought and, if captured, enslaved as punishment for crimes committed against my subjects. So, what she did there was she protected the Indians, but if they were found to be or said to be cannibals, they could be enslaved. So, what white people did is they said all Indians, all Africans, all Native people are cannibals. And they propagandized that idea consistently, right? So much so that it became a part of the folklore and popular imagination of many nations that Native Americans and Africans are cannibals. This early distinction between Indians and cannibals would eventually give way to the thought that all Indians and Indian were cannibals, heathens, or subject to cannibalistic practices. Similarly, Europeans, generally speaking, believed diverse African groups from one end of the continent to the other were a cannibalistic race. 19th century Europeans and Americans created the idea that heathen Africans, the idea of the heathen African, which also implied cannibalism. Speaking of the Christian reformation of the African cannibal, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher defined heathenism in 1850 as derived from idolatry, from fornication and incest, from infanticide and cannibalism. Today, a growing body of cannibalism scholarship has developed that spans the disciplines of literature, anthropology, history, philosophy, political economy, cultural studies, and post colonial studies. In fact, cannibalism is said by many scholars to be one of the most important topics in cultural criticism today. An exciting outcome of this emerging corpus of cannibalism scholarship is that it takes us beyond the Eurocentric master narrative of cannibalism into a complex arena that includes, for example, recent sophisticated work on African Maine and Azande customs and practices of cannibalism. We now have a deeper understanding of the human sacrifice and consumption rituals of Aztec and other Mesoamerican people. We also have studies that excavate and analyze European legacies of religious, medicinal, and survival cannibalism, and still other studies that locate the cannibalistic urge within the European Enlightenment itself, within the workings of the modern and postmodern European and American state. So the idea of cannibalism is inherent to the creation and functioning of the European and the American states. The post-colonial branch of contemporary cannibalism studies has been most helpful in my work. This branch has, more than any other, undertaken to unearth and analyze the cannibalism discourses that arose from colonial contact between Europeans and Africans and Native Americans. As I emphasized earlier, Europeans were not the only ones who understood the colonial encounter in terms of cannibalism. On both sides of the Atlantic, in Africa and the Americas, Black and African people in the 19th century documented this culture in slave and travel narratives, political philosophy and treaties, newspaper articles and sermons, among other types of documentation. For example, the famous 1839 slave insurrection aboard the ship Amistad occurred because the Mende revolt leader, Singbe Pai, and those who followed him feared that Spanish enslavers intended to eat them. As I have demonstrated, the African belief that Europeans were cannibals is not uncommon. Importantly, such beliefs represented the captured Africans' first articulations of an intersection between themselves, their bodies, erotic life force, labor capacity, and exoticization, and the Europeans' hunger for new land, physical and psychic contact with foreign others, and a perfect state of global dominion. The logical and incisiveness of those first African critiques of European cannibalism have accrued power and congealed into a number of contemporary African cannibal discourses. For example, in contemporary Sierra Leone, the land of those original Mende aboard the Amistad, cannibalism serves as a politically charged hidden transcript intended to expose, discredit, and disrupt the imbricated relations of power at work in Sierra Leone during the late 1980s, just prior to its descent into civil war. Today, in the context of post colonial African political struggles, the language of inequality continues to revolve around the metaphors of eating and, by extension, cannibalistic consumption. The trope of cannibalism as a symbol for the economic exploitation, material accumulation, and violent coercion carried out by post colonial elites has, in fact, come to dominate African political discourse. Because the examples of cannibalism that I use in this book range from figurative tropes to literal flesh eating to rituals of flesh taking and harvesting, I employ a cluster of terms that delineate the range of applications and cannibalism contexts that my study encompasses. This list includes the words consume, consumption, social consumption, appetite, taste, delectable, delectability, hunger, ingestion, and auto cannibalism. I use the words cannibalism and consumption interchangeably. The phrase a culture of consumption might elsewhere appear as a cannibal culture. I frequently use consumption as a modifier in consumption rituals and consumption practices. I think that my preference for the word consumption has something to do with the word's rootedness in modern notions of market economies, commodities, consumer appetite, and so forth. While my usage is always particular and usually grounded in human to human exchanges, I always have in mind the affluent ruling class 18th and 19th century economies that make possible the consumption of the slave along with other traded commodities such as liquors, spices, and foodstuffs from foreign lands. I use the words taste, appetite, and delectable mostly to refer to how the desire for the African slave or American black person had Epicurean implications. This desire was less about literal consumption and more about the cultivated taste the white person developed for the African. Whites often satiated this taste and appetite through acts of violence and sexual exploitation, imagined ingestion of the black, or through staged rituals designed to incrementally harvest black spirit and soul. The delectability of the black person was, of course, a factor in literal flesh consumption, but my main point, which I explained at length in chapter 1, is that literal cannibalism always occurred within cultural ideological contexts. The cultural context to which I frequently refer, the plantation, the slave ship, the general schooner, the African coastal town, were highly eroticized situations and locales. The word delectable, taste, and appetite bring together homoeroticism in these contexts with overlapping occurrences of consumption. My use of the word hunger relates to the idea of auto cannibalism. Auto cannibalism, or self consumption, involves people consuming themselves voluntarily or through external coercion. In many instances, the cultivation of literal or emotional hunger in the slave produced the opposite effect: the hunger for familial connection, for self and safety, and the ability to resist literal and spiritual consumption led to just that: resistance and reclamation in the slave. In the second part of the book, chapters 5 and 6, this idea of hunger takes prominence as I delineate the numerous ways the slave resisted cannibalism, struggled mightily against the institutionalized urge for self consumption. The emphasis upon the economic and metastructural in contemporary cannibalism discourse, especially within the post colonial branch, was intended to obscure the underlying erotic implications of cannibalism between Europeans and Africans. This body of belief and political philosophy tends to evade or stop short of addressing issues of sexuality, sexual power, desire, and same sex eroticism. I foreground same sex eroticism because it brings the focus to issues of desire, power, and gender formation and helps me to establish cannibalism in an originary framework for the emergence of homoeroticism out of the transatlantic slave trade and plantation culture. Give me one moment, guys. I'll be right back. I'm sorry about that. I apologize. My cat was apparently hungry. So I had to do something about that. So, at the juncture where homoeroticism and cannibalism intersected, a new type of cannibalism system, beliefs, and practices emerged. On the continent of Africa, encounters with white Christian minister cannibals expanded traditional Western and Central African cannibal beliefs to include the church, mercantilism, and European imperialism as institutionalized venues of cannibalism and resources of consumption. In the South, the complexity and newness of this cannibal system registered in legal and religious discussion about Christian cannibalism and an existent cannibal jurisdiction within Southern legislative and geographic territories. Slavery as history and memory. Much of the contemporary scholarship on the African diaspora or Black Atlantic has tended to follow Gilroy's path, emphasizing routes of transmission instead of the roots of origins and cultural legacy. An unfortunate result of this approach to the Black Atlantic is that, as Houston Baker Jr. notes, much of the multi locational history of specific diasporic communities gets erased or overlooked. In particular, Baker takes issue with Gilroy's mishandling of the history and legacy of slavery and bondage. The Black Atlantic remains surprisingly abstract and indeterminate with respect to the very chronotype the book claims as its analytical organizing symbol, namely ships in motion across spaces between Europe, America, Africa, and the Caribbean. In fact, after early mention, ships virtually disappear from Gilroy's work. They disappear as chronotypes, material vessels, transplanting Black populations, dread transports of conquered peoples to penal colonies of the Americas, ships as interdisciplinary and carceral holds on the shackled Black body received no extensive treatment in the Black Atlantic. As Baker does in Turning South Again, Rethinking Modernism, Rereading Booker T, I also aim to bring together ships and plantations. For this issue of roots of cultural transmission is not simply a matter of revising or changing the master narrative from Eurocentric to African origins of Black American culture. Rather, at stake in this debate over cultural origins is a deeper understanding of the ways in which, for example, the penal politics of slavery and chattel bondage speak to current political phenomena, such as the incarceration of Black people and Black men in particular, economic issues of racial reparations, and the larger systemic sedimentation of racial inequality and issues of trauma and post traumatic stress that affect the ideological and material aspects of Black uplift politics and communities. To give a more concrete example of the contemporary implications of the cultural origins debate, in Chapter 5, I examine how William Styron's historical novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner, occasioned the first ever public debate on the subject of homosexuality in the context of slavery. This national debate occurred in the 1960s, demonstrated how, for Black people, the memory of slavery and questions of cultural origins attached to the slave ship had profound political implications rooted in the history and memory of slavery. My trans historical approach to slavery is informed in part by contemporary calls in African American cultural studies for the excavation of documented material on the subject of homoeroticism during slavery. Many Black gay scholars in the 1990s saw their contemporary dislocation from Black communities and political infrastructures as linked to a larger history of dislocation and silencing dating back to slavery. Charles I. Nero, for example, felt that the 1980s Afrocentrist Black arts spokesperson and Black power advocates might have changed their ideas about Black gays as threats to and pariahs within Black families had they known that homoeroticism existed during slavery. So he felt that if Black people had more information about how homoeroticism impacted us during our enslavement, that we would look at Black gay people differently. Referencing a few antebellum court cases in which Black men were persecuted for sodomy offenses, Nero wrote, although the evidence for homosexual practices among Black male slaves is small, it does suggest that we do not exclude homoeroticism from life on the plantation. Beyond these instances of criminalization, Nero concludes that additional evidence of homosexuality excavated from diaries, letters, and narratives would go a long way toward helping us to revise are models of the Black family and of homosexuality as alien to Black culture. So we would see it as part of our culture and something that happened within our culture if we accepted the fact that during our enslavement, homosexuality is something that was a part of what was going on the plantation. Now, was that forced upon us during the plantation? Was that something that the European brought into our purview and we did? Or was that something that we were already doing? Who knows? Intuitively, Black gay men understood the issue of homosexuality during slavery as a complex phenomenon shaped by a number of factors, including the nation's unresolved relationship with to the legacy of slavery. Black liberatory ideology dating back to slavery, and most importantly, the maintenance of traditional notions of family and community that originated in the 18th and 19th centuries. The legacy and memory of slavery had a powerful effect that left many Black gay men feeling isolated from and rendered invisible within Black communities. Joseph Beam said it first and best: I cannot go home as who I am. When I speak of home, I mean not only the familial constellation from which I grew, but the entire Black community. The Black press, the Black church, Black academics, the Black literati, and the Black left. I am most often rendered invisible, perceived as a threat to the family, or am tolerated if I am silent and inconspicuous. Beam's comments echo Black back through time to the threatening relationship between the homosexual Bayard Rustin and the civil rights movement, and before Rustin to the homosexual threat that Augustus Dill represented to the Crisis magazine and W.E.B. Du Bois. Both Rustin and Dill experienced scandalous public sex incidents in the 50s and the 20s, respectively, that involved arrests, and in Rustin's case, widely circulated media attention. Both men, loyal and dedicated racial liberation advocates, were asked by key Black figures to remove themselves from organizing centers of the civil rights and Reconstruction movements. As Philip Bryan Harper has noted, the Black homosexual functioned in the 20th century as an index for Black masculine anxieties. These ranged from the very personal and painful anxieties of lynching, castration, and the denial of civil rights to a larger set of anxieties rooted in historical erasure and cultural genocide. So, do you think that the Black community overall is homophobic? I don't think that we really care. We just don't want it in our face. I don't think that we really care. We don't want it in our face. And no, you can't be the prominent leader or example of normal because unfortunately, unfortunately, homosexuals cannot create life by themselves. They need an opposite sex partner to create life. And I think that because Black people are all about procreation in the normal, natural way, that it comes across as homophobic because we don't want them leading our movements. We'll accept their help, but we don't want them leading our movements. Black gays in the late 20th century found themselves in a double bind of history and memory, which had an unfortunate result. Black people equated their sexual identities with homosexual violation dating back to slavery. In response to this system, in response to this dynamic, such black gay scholars as Robert F. Reed Farr, Derek Scott, Nero, Marlon Ross, Charles Clifton, Dwight A. McBride, Harper, Lyndon Barrett, and Ron Simmons, among others, took this opportunity to historicize their sexual identities and subject positions to call attention to the ways in which Black people, at least since the Reconstruction era, have conflated the legacy of homosexuality during slavery with the 20th century notion of the Black faggot or Negro homosexual. For example, Eldridge Cleaver associated anal sex between a white man and a black man as a racial death wish extending back to slavery with miscegenation. Cleaver conflated his contemporary understanding of the homosexual person with the particular and different ways in which homosexuality was thought of and configured into the context of slavery. Working with Cleaver's idea of the Negro homosexual, Reed Farr asserts that in Black Gay Man, to be fucked in the ass by the white man is not simply to be overcome by white culture, white intellect, and white notions of superiority. Contradicting Cleaver, Reed Farr suggests that the act of anal penetration, at least in the realm of memory, opens up space for the reconstruction of the Black imaginary, such that the most sacrosanct of Black truths might be transgressed. That sounds crazy. How is giving your ass to a white person supposed to open you up to some greater, larger truth? But okay. Truly, the inability to creatively imagine homosexuality during slavery reflected a fundamental fear within the Black collective of moving outside of the normative categories of masculinity, reproduction, pleasure, and family. Elaborating on this point, Reed Farr notes that Black people are most accustomed to thinking of Black feminine violation during slavery because this theme resonates with a long history of Black American literature and lore in which the licentious white man acts as an absolute spoiler of Black desire. Reed Farr's assertions are borne out in the heart rending depictions in Black men's slave narratives and autobiographies of Black mothers, Black daughters, and Black wives raped by white men, or the whole lynching and raping dynamic wherein Black men are the historical objects of lynching and castration, and women serve as the historical objects of rape. The image of the white Southerner fucking the Black man, however, throws all this into confusion. Reed Farr contends it did not occur to Cleaver or to many of his compatriots in the 1960s that a sexually receptive Black man during slavery might have absolutely nothing to do, historically speaking, with a self declared cosmopolitan homosexual man living in the 1960s or 1990s. In the 20th century, our most prevalent examples of same sex contact during slavery have tended to focus on anal rape and other types of sexual abuse, a fact that underscores the issue of memory, or more specifically, the failure and inability to imagine homosexuality in complicated ways during slavery. This was the problem that Nero had with Morrison's depiction of Black men preferring sex with animals and performing forced fellatio on white prison guards in Beloved. Deborah McDowell suggests in order to see Black masculinity during slavery in a more complicated frame, we may have to revise our prevailing genealogy, our way of locating Black male heroicism and virility at the center of Black uplift and liberation in the 19th century. Citing Douglas's slave narratives, McDowell focuses on his omission of his matrilineal legacy, suggesting that his gender, sex, and uplift politics derive from the female body, Black female subjugation, mother hunger and loss, rape and sexual violation, as opposed to the genealogy of white male dominance and authority that Douglas foregrounds. A Black feminist, E. Frances White, has admitted that for her and many others, the issue of homosexuality during slavery brings to the surface ambivalent feelings. Nevertheless, she encourages scholars of the African American experience to explore the implications of homosexual rape and its relationship to heterosexual rape. Furthermore, she advocates that we inquire with Morrison like curiosity why historians have presented the African American past as if it only as if the only sexual concerns that the Black man had during slavery were castration and whether they could protect and for some control the Black woman's body. Baker enacted just such a revision when he asserted in Turning South Again that there existed a deeply homoerotic bond between Booker T. Washington and all white men, but in particular and most expressly between the Wizard of Tuskegee and General Armstrong. Baker's comments, while speculative and cautious in his text, reflect a gradual turning within African American scholarship toward the erotic and interior lives of Black men during slavery. All told, we have, at the end of the 20th century, a collective call to move, to excavate homoerotic materials and theoretical frameworks as a means of redefining and better understanding the African American and larger American experience. The Delectable Negro responds to this collective call for a deeper, more useful understanding of homosexuality in the context of slavery by focusing on the 19th century as a moment in which Black masculinity, racial identity, homoeroticism, and distinctive American appetites for Black male flesh and soul congealed. I concur with Maurice O. Wallace that still today too few critics and historians have pursued the problems and paradoxes inherent within Black male enslavement. Wallace's excellent and wide ranging study constructing the Black masculine identity and ideality in African American men literature and culture, 1775 to 1995, foregrounds sexuality, homosocial behavior, and Black masculine anxiety as crucial social and theoretical frames for Black masculine studies. Focusing on the 18th century and 19th centuries, his approach to the study of Black masculinity marks a general shift echoed in more recent works that deal explicitly and implicitly with Black masculinity and in the 19th and early 20th centuries among them. Turning South Again, Rethinking Modern Modernism, Rethinking Booker T by Baker, Manning the Race, Reforming Black Men in the Jim Crow Era by Ross, Impossible Witnesses, Truth, Abolitionism, and Slave Testimony by McBride, Are We Not Men? Masculine Anxiety and the Problem of African American Identity by Harper, and Conjugal Union, The Body, the House, and the Black American by Reed Farr. No study on Black masculinity in the 19th century focuses on homoeroticism. This partly has to do with the issues of material evidence that have been duly noted by scholars of the African American experience. Many have argued that there simply are not enough primary materials available to conduct a study. Contrary, though, to these claims of absence, I argue that homoeroticism did exist among 19th century Black peoples, chattel or free, literate or non literate, though a number of factors have prevented us from being able to discern and engage with the subject of homoeroticism as it existed then. Most importantly, our contemporary framing of homosexuality has obscured our vision. In addition, the absence of an appropriate linguistic apparatus, the dearth of historical documentation, and the lack of theoretical models with which to excavate homoeroticism from extant historical documents have all contributed to a lack of substantive information on the subject of homoeroticism. The existing materials on homoeroticism that I work with in this study include slave narratives, works progress administration interviews of ex slaves, advertisements for runaway slaves, neo slave narratives, journals, diaries, novels, poetry, and historical fiction. Most of the materials that I work with are staples of African American literature and culture, such as the narratives of Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass. Other materials, such as James L. Smith's slave narratives, advertisements for runaway slaves, and numerous articles from Black newspapers published in the 19th century, are additions to the archive. In this way, I have attempted to respond to the call for the excavation of materials on the subject of homoeroticism during slavery. The chapters of this book conform to my theoretical framing of homoeroticism in the context of cannibal culture as a derivative of African homosexual practices constituted in the Americas. Chapter 1, Cannibalism in Transatlantic Context, opens with the examination of Oluda Equino's well known narrative, The Interesting Life of Oluda Equino or Gustavus Vasa the African, written by himself. Equino's narrative brings together the themes of homoeroticism and cannibalism. It gives ample examples of Europeans and West African beliefs about cannibalism in the context of young Aquino's romantic, chivalric relationship formed aboard the slave ship with a young white American lad from the slave owning South. Scholars have tended to dismiss the depictions of cannibalism in the narrative. I treat them seriously and use them to establish an interconnection between cannibalism and chattel homoeroticism and to establish transatlantic context for incidents of cannibalism and homoerotic interactions in U.S. plantation culture that I discuss in the second chapter. In chapter 2, Sex, Honor, and Human Consumption, I examine literal and symbolic examples of human consumption in the antebellum South of the United States. I begin this with a discussion of the above mentioned Essex affair, which involved the consumption of four black men in the 19th century, isolating issues of male secrecy, shame, and honor inherent in the Essex affair. I moved to a broader discussion of the same issues in the slave narratives of black men who documented their social consumption. Finally, in the context of Black male lives and voices, I look at the widespread 19th century concern over whether the United States was becoming a cannibal nation. This debate, which occurred among the clergy, congressmen, judges, and artists, among others, centered upon slavery as an essentially consumptive institution. The third chapter, A Tale of Hunger Retold, Ravishment and Hunger in F. Douglass's Life and Writing, focuses on Frederick Douglass's depiction of human consumption as a phenomenon that ate away at the psyche and soul. None was more articulate than Douglass about how these dimensions of the consumption of slaves eroded one's ability to resist and strategize against slavery. His observations in this chapter provide a blueprint for how the slave struggled in mind, emotions, and spirit, not only against social consumption, but against endemic mechanisms of starvation and hunger designed to break the enslaved person. Douglass's own hunger for self, familial and ancestral bonds, and civil status manifested as complex erotic ties to white men and cross gender behavior. Douglass's gender variant and homoerotic experiences provide an opportunity to think anew about 19th century models of Black masculinity and gender variant and tied to emotional erotic urges. The focus of chapter 4, Incest and Human Consumption, is Harriet Jacobs' incident in the life of a slave girl. Jacobs' narrative depicts some of the more graphic scenes of human consumption ever portrayed in the U.S. slave narrative. She depicts masters within the domestic realm as epicures of black flesh, sex, terror, and institutionalized hunger and starvation. Focusing on Luke, a black man raped by his master, and Jacobs herself, I elucidate the intersections between the incestuous plantation dynamics and the culture of human consumption. Both Luke and Jacobs are infantilized and form part of a genealogy of human consumption that for the master and mistress extends back to childhood and learned psychophantic relationships with mammy figures, black uncles, and black playmates. Chapters 5 and 6 look at the topic of human consumption from more contemporary perspectives. Chapter 5, Eating Nat Turner, focuses on William Styron's novel The Confessions of Nat Turner, written in 1967. This novel, along with 10 Black Writers Respond, written in 1968, the edited Black response to the novel, marked the first time that the subject of homosexuality during slavery received sustained public debate. I focus on what many Black intellectuals and activists call Styron's homosexual representation and degradation of Nat Turner's life and revolutionary efforts. Other Black male critics of Styron's novel accused him of infeminizing and cannibalizing Nat Turner. As I have mentioned, Turner's corpse was treated in a manner that suggests it might have been consumed as medicine and dispensed as a component of pharmacological serums. In this chapter, I explore homoeroticism and cannibalism as transhistorical phenomena, linking the consumptive history presented in chapters 1 and 2 and the political insurgents of the 60s. The final chapter of the book, chapter 6, The Hungry Nigger, opens up with an examination of the controversy surrounding the chain gang oral sex scene in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Black male responses to this scenario and the novel in general have ranged from accusations of homophobia to lambasting of Morrison's valorization of Black suffering to reading the scene as a psychoanalytic encapsulation of Black male erotic life on the plantation. I suggest that the profound usefulness of this scenario is in conveying how, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, we are still at a loss for language and appropriate metaphors with which to describe Black male hunger within a plantation culture of consumption. Hunger serves in the novel as an index for a culture of consumption, for Black male emotional loss, trauma, and need, and for a complex Black male erotic life. I draw parallels between Morris's novels and late 19th century neo slave narratives. From Morrison's novel, I segue into a more formal theorization of what I call the Black male orifice. This section of the chapter takes into account the long standing historical challenge of theorizing and thinking through Black male erotic orifices, the anus and the mouth in particular. Working with Baker's notion of the tight place, I suggest that we need to ground these erotic regions along with the notion of Black men hungering in actual historical places. To this end, I sketch a genealogy of the Black male orifice that recuperates the Middle Passage, plantation slavery, and transatlantic slavery as homoerotic and erogenous zones of the Black male experience. As a final prelude, I pose the question: what if the 19th century cannibalism question and debate pointed in a direction of inquiry we desperately needed to resolve? And from this side of things, what if we in this contemporary movement have a responsibility to make sense of that question, tracing its outgrowths to our current political and social climates? And that is the end of chapter 1. So, as you can see, this has been heavily edited. This has been heavily edited by a white liberal that is gay to bring to fruition his understanding of a Black queer man's thoughts and intentions because he never met the man. He didn't even know him. And the two Black men that were involved in bringing this work to fruition, Dwight A. McBride and E. Patrick Johnson, allowed Justin to write and to have a lot of literary freedom when it came to how this particular topic was presented to the masses. And he articulated the fact that he found so many errors and omissions in the citations that he felt that it was necessary to change many of the original words and thoughts and opinions of the author. And he is making these connections between the grotesque aspects of male rape and cannibalism, because the original author, Vincent Woodward, might have had a different perspective. The forecast. Oh, peace, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Forecast had a lot to say, but they want us to be like them, right? With their Greek culture and Epstein culture. They want us to be them so bad that they will take a dead man's life's work, reframe it, repackage it, send it through the filter of their understanding, and try to feed it to us as reality. What we need to recognize is that consumption happens literally and metaphorically. What we need to understand is that some of the things that we do every day for work, for labor, for employment, are literally sucking the life out of us. What we need to understand is that how they decided to cut back on these people's food stamps and benefits is a form of them starving us out. What we need to understand is that if given the wrong situation on the wrong day, they will kill us and eat us. Those are the things we need to understand, right? And once we understand this about them and their culture, then we can begin to move differently around them so that we are not putting ourselves at risk. So, my suggestions: try to find something that you're good at, that you can make money off of, that does, whether it requires you going to work for the white man or not, that's fine. You just need to find something that you're good at that you can make money at. S- Hard trades like trucking, electrician, plumbing, those types of things are the things that we need in our community. Uh, Being a customer service representative, that's a job that's dead because AI is going to take over that job, right? And they're not going to replace the workforce. They're going to replace the customer service workforce with AI agents. So they have consumed all that they can consume from those representatives, and slowly but surely every business that you go to, whether it's fast food restaurant, your health insurance carrier, your mortgage company, whomever, they are consistently consuming the humans and feeding the AI so that they are able to replace the humans with the AI. Don't be alone with white friends, right? Because whether they kill you or they consume you, they are more likely to put you in a position where you don't come home if you are with white friends, because white people are not your friends. They fetishize you. You are a fetish for them. You are something interesting to experience and look at. You are not their friend. They look at you as a freak. And they resent you more when you think you're one of them than they do when you are just being yourself around other black people. They resent black joy, but they resent black sellouts even more. Like, they will talk bad about you behind your back. And lastly, educate your children on these things. Make a pathway for them to not have to go into the white world to make it for themselves, right? Figure out something, whether it's a life insurance policy or investments or hell, even a Trump account, something so that your children don't have to go into these white spaces so that they can get trades that they can bring back into the community so that they can do the things that we need to do that are community building, right? All right, guys, that's the end. I want to thank the forecast, KW Don 7, Anthony McPhail, and Cicely Milano for being here. I know that Sister Raw and the elders are listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Brother Bakari is listening, and so many others. If you're new here, please hit the like and subscribe button. I go live on Tuesdays and Thursdays, some within the 9 o'clock hour. It'll be between 9 a.m. but before 10 p.m. Make sure that you hit the notification bell so that you know when I'm live. I appreciate and value each and every one of you. I'm back, guys. Peace.